was interesting or helpful, that would be great. So the first idea it has to do with sort of how US labor law deals with mis and disinformation. So Ron talked a bit about the regulation of mis and disinformation in US political elections, and some of the other American contributors will talk about that in more detail. At the same time, there is also this other system of American law, right, in which elections are regulated by an administrative agency, the National Labor Relations Board, where there is just a separate way of dealing with election problems, including mis and disinformation. So as background, I mean, this will probably not be a tremendous surprise to folks, but mis and disinformation is a significant part of union avoidance strategies, as they are often known in the United States, and that has been true for a long time. So mis and disinformation really became a key part of union avoidance as early as, and probably before this, but certainly in the 1930s, when federal law created legal protections for the right to organize, and sort of took some of the, caused employers to pull back a bit on the use of violence to stop unionization and break strikes. This leads to, the search for other strategies, such as, well, what about painting strikers or painting organizers as, dangerous outside agitators who don't speak for the workers and are here to generally stir up trouble. That strategy was sometimes deployed in a way that it also can be deployed in kind of like in the context of like civil rights protests, where it's seeking to draw and justify, repressive state violence, right? So in some ways, like mis and disinformation, the labor organizing context can be a route to, the prohibited state violence as a response to organizing. Today, misinformation remains part of the strategy. It's fairly standard to see employers respond to organizing and respond to strikes in sort of much the same way, although not necessarily generally not with the kind of violent response coupled with it. So labor law has sort of oscillated about what to do about all this. And at times, the National Labor Relations Board has taken the position that material misinformation advanced by either a union or an employer that occurs close in time to a union election, such that there can't be a kind of substantive counter-speech response from the other side, should result in a rerun election. So, this was robustly board doctrine most recently in the 1960s, and you can imagine what the current Supreme Court would do with it. But there have been times where let's run the election again, has been the remedy for mis and disinformation. Currently, there are a few specific kinds of mis and disinformation that are perceived as especially problematic that can still give rise to rerun elections. So misrepresentations that involve impersonating a government agency or the other side. Statements that bargaining is futile, There's no point in having a union election, or there's no point in unionizing. Also appeals to racial and religious prejudice. Classic examples from the 1950s include employer claims that, for example, white CIO organizers had sort of personal relationships, friendships, or romantic relationships with Black people used to divide workforces. So those can still give rise, those are still forms of misinformation that can still give rise to rerun labor union elections. Okay, it's not terribly helpful though. So these rerun elections often just result in, the same results just several months later, in part because they give rise to usually the employer being able to say, well, this is just sour grapes, you've spoken, the workforce have spoken, the union didn't like your answer, and now here they are running to the government to get another bite at the apple, and that seems to be like fairly persuasive. The other possibility that exists, although it's quite rare, is for the board to just issue what's called a bargaining order, right? Which is for the board to say the consequence of this election-related misconduct was so great, we don't think there can be a fair election at any point in the foreseeable future, so we are just going to award the win to the union. And that means the employer has to begin to bargain in good faith. Again, that doesn't always work super well, because the remedies for failing to bargain in good faith are, believe it or not, a government order saying bargain in good faith and not, financial consequences. But, in theory, at least, right? In theory, with stronger remedies, that could be a more effective deterrent against mis or disinformation. Okay, so that's kind of like one part of this. And then the other part is sort of what do unions as civil society institutions and as representatives of groups of employees do with respect to mis and disinformation where it exists. So there is a significant US political science literature about ways and reasons that unions are sort of good for democracy, reducing income inequality, reducing racial resentment, improving elected officials' responsiveness to working class concerns, increase working class participation in politics, both as candidates and as voters. And, there's sort of a whole set of interrelated reasons why this is true. But what about mis and disinformation in particular? So some mis and disinformation comes from employers, and it goes from employers to their workforces. A mine owner telling a group of workers, Hillary Clinton's environmental plan will put you out of work. It will be disastrous for the company. You should vote against her. Right? Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. Maybe the employer believes that it's true. Maybe they don't. It's extremely common for US employers to convey political messages to their own workforces. A study by a 2018 study by a political scientist found 1 in 4 private sector employees said that they received political messages or requests from their bosses. Mitt Romney famously encouraged this practice. He told business owners, make it very clear to your employees what you believe is in the best interest of your enterprise and therefore their job and their future in the upcoming election, right? He emphasized there is nothing illegal about you talking to your employees about what you believe is best for the business, because I think that will figure into their election decision, their voting decision, and of course, doing that with your family and your kids as well. So it's hard to even know when this is going on, right? Unless there is some sort of NGO that represents the workers, right? Unless there is, a union in place or some sort of equivalent organization that happens to know, right? Because they're there in the workplace, what's going on, and that might have some kind of counter message to convey to employees. So this is right. This is another version of this sort of NGO kind of counter speech that might be brought to bear, where information that may or may not qualify as like mis or disinformation in the way we've been talking about it, or the way like Sunstein talks about it, but what might nonetheless influence, or we might even say coerce, people's voting decisions. Other sort of responses along these lines, so a few states have laws that say workers can't be fired for refusing to attend captive audience meetings during which the employer expresses their views on religion, politics, or unionization. Those are becoming a bit more popular, unclear whether they'll withstand Supreme Court review, but there are Oregon, Connecticut, a few other states are thinking about enacting these laws. And then last, I think it's really interesting to think about unions of workers whose jobs involve educating the public, right? Who in the course of those jobs might sort of come up close and personal with to mis and disinformation, and the relationship of those workers and their unions and their collective action in holding institutions to kind of their espoused values, right? So I'm talking about kind of mainstream media here, right? I'm not talking about like the right-wing, media ecosphere. So, journalists, teachers, professors, librarians, right? Like it's interesting to think about how they might bring collective pressure to bear when, for example, the organization they work for is being, pressured to not cover some story, pressured to withdraw a claim that they've made that, is, that may not actually be false, to not teach certain subjects because they're controversial, right, and so on. I've so far focused on journalists, but I think there are similar stories to tell, right, about these other professions. And I guess like one direction I could take this chapter is just thinking about unions of those groups, right, and sort of drawing examples from teachers unions, higher ed, librarians, and journalists. Journalists have been unionized since the 1930s. Their employers have fought unionization since the 1930s. Employers have relied on the First Amendment, right? So news organizations, of course, and journalists, of course, rely on the First Amendment to do their jobs, and news organizations also take the position in litigation that the First Amendment ought to mean that they can fire their journalists for unionizing if they want to. A recent there's been a recent kind of wave of unionization of journalists in the US, started in digital media, has also been kind of sweeping some traditional outlets. So, the Los Angeles Times, for example, unionized in 2018. There are like plenty of other examples. And this has been driven by a set of factors that are sort of generally bad for journalism, right? So the inability for a lot of news outlets in the US to kind of figure out a monetization model that works has led to this kind of wave of outlets going out of business or of being acquired by hedge funds or of merging with, with other kind of existing behemoths. Sometimes with, sort of disastrous results for, for the public and for journalists themselves. And so sometimes that looks like, hedge funds buying up outlets and selling them off for parts. And sometimes it looks like, Sinclair Media Group buying a set of local news stations and then requiring the anchors that work for them to run these must-run segments where they're required to mouth like certain right-wing views as though they are their own views. So what do journalism unions do about all of this? A few things, right? So some of the kind of traditional stuff that every union does, negotiating for higher wages, non-discrimination rules, just cause protections, which otherwise don't exist in the United States. They negotiate over layoffs, right? All things that could help journalism be a profession that is accessible and available to people who are not sort of otherwise independently wealthy, right? Leading to perhaps a broader array of sort of a broader range of views. And also some kind of specialist stuff. It's not uncommon to see sort of editorial standards language in CBAs. It's not uncommon to see some protections for journalists during the editing process, the ability to be consulted and to respond to proposed changes. The right to refuse to run their byline with a story that they believe has been changed during the editing process in a way they can't agree with. Rules that relate to when work can be outsourced to freelancers, and rules about what will happen if somebody asks for a retraction or sues a journalist, right? Including that the outlet will pay for legal counsel for a journalist being sued. And then finally, journalism unions have kind of acted as a base of operations for advocacy in relation to mergers and acquisitions of outlets, at times managing to kind of successfully fend off certain especially problematic potential acquisitions. So certainly there are limits to their effectiveness, right? And some of those are related to general limits on unions' effectiveness under American labor law. But there's also this irony that I alluded to a few minutes ago as it relates to the First Amendment, right? So, again, obviously the First Amendment type protections are necessary for journalists to do their job. At the same time, the judicial view of the First Amendment that brought us all Citizens United has also brought us circuit court decisions that journalists and their unions lose the protection of labor law when they try to bargain or strike over editorial policies specifically. So in some ways, like the most valuable thing that journalism unions do in this regard is the thing that's least likely to have protection of federal labor law. Obviously, that's not the only way to interpret the First Amendment, right? A sort of First Amendment that took account of democratic values in a more nuanced way might reach a different decision. That's not the Supreme Court we have at the moment. So I will, it's 4:03, so we're supposed to end 3 minutes ago. But, any kind of questions or reactions either now or at dinner, would be fabulous.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have a question?
So if we know Fox News from the settlement in the Dominion case, knowingly and repeatedly propagated false information about the 2020 election. Would a unionized workforce, in your view, have made a difference? That's one question. Second, do unions engage in broad-based voter registration and voter information campaigns as part of what they do? I thought I recall hearing or reading that the Nevada Senate election in 2020 and the presidential election in 2020 in Nevada were both heavily influenced and probably turned in part through union electioneering. And finally, are unions generally better or worse positioned, in your view, than organizations like Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight Action, League of Women Voters, Common Cause, to fight disinformation and misinformation that's directly related to elections and voting? What role do unions have there? And are they more or less capable than, say, Fair Fight Action to fill that space?
Yeah, so would it help if Fox News employees were unionized? It depends who Fox News employees are, right? So I don't think it would hurt if they were unionized. However, it wouldn't necessarily help because presumably you go to work at Fox News because you're interested in doing what Fox News does. Similarly, right, I don't think like US police unions are going to be tremendously helpful in the fight against disinformation, right? If anything, they sometimes convey misinformation. So the difference, right, is that, I think journalists who go to work at kind of legacy outlets or outlets that have that don't have that kind of relationship to people who go to work at organizations that aim for journalistic excellence, I guess, likely have that as their goal, right? And so they are just more likely, right, to want to push back if the outlet that they work for strays. So some of these cases, some of these First Amendment cases have arisen in the context of unionization efforts that have sprung up directly in response to journalist perception that the owner of the outlet has gone astray, right? That there's a new edict that's come down that says, don't cover this issue, right? Don't write about this person who's like a friend of the owners or something. And the journalists are like, that's not what we were trained to do, right? We're here to kind of fearlessly uncover the truth. We need a union to push back. And so then you get the outlets saying like, oh, but we have a First Amendment right to control the editorial, direction of this paper, and courts saying, yes, we agree with that. Unions are somewhat, there's political science literature on this, are better at doing voter engagement than organizations like League of Women Voters or Common Cause, because of their close relationship to workers, right? It's not just there's this huge national organization and they're like text spamming people, right? It's like, oh, this union steward and this, local union president have relationships with this workforce that they develop over the course of, years potentially, right, in a variety of contexts. And so they're very trusted. And they talk about, at least some unions talk about political issues all the time. So it's not just like there's an election coming up, voting is really important. It's we've built this base of workers who are politically active, and now they're doing, and now we're like, empowering them, right, giving them the kind of outside structure and resources to get out the vote with their friends and family. I don't know, I don't know very much about Stacey Abrams' organization. It might very well be a sort of similarly grassroots effort.
So this is just ignorance, because I assume that if unions can come together in a big organization, union of journalists of different companies, the effect of this can be much bigger than if it's only the union of a particular media outlet.
Yeah.
How does it work in America?
Yeah, so US labor law embraces only enterprise-based bargaining. Multi-employer or sectoral bargaining is available like at employers' discretion, and employers do not generally agree. So it is certainly true that, the LA Times union is part of the News Guild, and, the Washington Post union or whatever is part of the News Guild, and that allows for sort of coordination of the union's individual, like separate efforts, but it hasn't led to sectoral bargaining.
Right. So where does the journalistic code of ethics intersect with the First Amendment?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that you're saying that the media houses can use First Amendment to say, we'll report on what we like, but surely the code of conduct would regulate that. I mean, I know it can't overwrite the Constitution, but what is the intersection between the two?
Purely voluntary. No, I mean, so yeah, I mean, news outlets can claim the protection of the First Amendment, whether or not they comply with any particular version of journalistic ethics.
Wouldn't they lose their license eventually? I mean, by undermining the code of conduct, wouldn't they be fined? Wouldn't
Yep. Right. Yeah. You're right. There's no penalties for news outlets that, except for, I guess, market-based penalties, but there's no sort of like
Right. You might actually do better by not practicing good journalism than by practicing it. If you look at like OAN and Newsmax.
Yeah.
that sort of regulations actually a problem in the US context, surely. Because I mean, the code of conduct, the ethical code, it's all about self-regulation, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, no, there's no like lawyers are, in the US licensed by a kind of self-governing body, but there's no equivalent for journalists. There's no sort of journalistic licensing.
In the American system, there are specific understanding coming from the Commission, the American Commission, and you can also understand that coming from an old decision of the court that code of ethics for journalists are good, but should not be imposed by the state.
Yeah,
It's self-imposed. And there is a lot of rationale behind that, which is if you have a code of ethics that was developed by the government and then impose that code of ethics, and it could be an infringement on.
But I agree with you there. But the point is it seems to me that in the US that the code of conduct is entirely voluntary. So you can open up a media outlet and not subscribe to the code of conduct of ethics.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's foreign to.
Yeah,
South
and
Africa has mandatory rules for journalists.
And there's a code of conduct that everyone subscribes to, and it's self-regulated. They've got their own regulatory tribunals, but it's done by the press themselves.
You don't have a Rupert Murdoch or a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk.
So you have all sorts of decisions coming out about hate speech on radio and things like that. Yeah, very interesting. A lot of our jurisprudence comes from there.
that's interesting.
Or Anderson to take a very active role. I mean, Charlotte, you didn't mention Jeff Bezos in the Post.
Yeah.
But, he's a liberal or
Yeah.
purports to be a progressive, but he doesn't want the Post to cover stuff that he doesn't like. And
Yeah.
Rupert Murdoch famously said, killed a story actually, or show on Fox Broadcasting on Clarence and Jenny Thomas. And when asked why by a press entity, he said, because Clarence Thomas is my friend.
No, I mean,
So
Yeah, there's this story that I sort of love about how the tagline "Democracy Dies in Darkness" was adopted by the Washington Post. Apparently, Bezos said it during an interview, a sort of public interview, "Democracy dies in darkness." He didn't make it up though. It turns out that he heard it from Carl Bernstein, I think, right? Famous discoverer of the Watergate break-in. Bernstein didn't make it up himself either.
Yeah.
He took it from an opinion by Damon Keith, who wrote it in a case about how the Bush administration couldn't exclude journalists from covering deportation proceedings by just designating them as special proceedings. So it sort of captures this ecosystem of kind of the First Amendment, sort of investigative journalism, the ownership of news outlets by billionaires in a way that kind of makes you feel uncomfortable about the media environment in the US.
we don't have the principle of subsidiarity, which Andras talked about earlier,
yeah.
where First Amendment principles simply have no application to the Washington Post at all.
Okay.
Except as a claimant, not as, it's
Yeah.
all privileges, not duties.
And also the principle of horizontality, which is a constitutional subsidiarity and horizontality, which are important. Interesting. Thank you, Sean.
Have any other questions? Well, I can't thank you guys enough. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I hope it was really going to help the construction of your chapters. I think there are some incredible points that were made. And I know I, for one, very much look forward to the book coming out, and I hope that we'll be able to do some sort of help with the book launch. It's been fascinating. So
That'd be
thank,
great.
thank you very, very much for joining us today and for all your hard work. And we look forward to it. And thank you to everybody online who's been following us. And we will do our best to get the video of this online, maybe tomorrow, or at least over the weekend. And there's been some requests for the PowerPoint presentations. So we will post what we can on our website, hopefully by next week. So thank you all very, very much.
Yes, thank you. Post is good.
That was great.